think there are several dimensions to globalization. One is very spatial specific. For example, poverty is localized, in certain specific areas. If we talk about environmental destruction, it's also very specific. I think when we talk about a flat world, we're talking about economics, finance, and these types of areas. And I think that we cannot trivialize globalization. And I think the problem that I see today is that a lot of attention is being paid to economics and finance for obvious reasons, but this is not all. The banking crisis is not all. Behind this banking crisis, there is a tremendous poverty crisis, hunger, unemployment, destruction of the family, destruction of local organizations, and so on. There is a human factor that is also universal but different in different parts of the world, and we need to reach these parts of the world. It's not like all of us think the same way. All of us have the same values. So the world is really not flat. We have flattened the world on certain things, but other things are not flat. There are many things that don't go through the internet. Love and compassion doesn't go through the internet. There are many things that don't go through the telephone lines, through the transport line, which are your feelings, your identity, your capacity to have a cohesive and a stable society, and so on and so forth. So what we are having here is a flat part of the world with many mountains we still need to conquer. So to trivialize globalization as making the whole world flat, to me, is an interesting proposition, an alarming proposition, but I don't think it's true. But I have to recognize, however, that we are living in many ways a world without frontiers, in culture, in music, in many, many different ways. And I think this raises a fundamental issue, that if the world is becoming flatter and flatter all the time, then what is our capacity to live a collective existence? Because we can say the world is flat, but we are making it a chess table only for few people. Whether flatness means equality, freedom, empowerment, opportunity, security. And what I see most of the time is that this flatness has created more risk, more insecurity, more uncertainty. Just look at the crisis of today, very flat. Someone here, in the secondary market for mortgages, creates a problem, and then the whole world has pneumonia in the real estate market, in the banking, and so on and so forth. And I think, yes, that is flat. But this raises the question whether we have the organizational structure, whether we have the institutions to manage a flat world. This flat world cannot be free for all world. A flat world cannot be a world with no regulation, no governance structures, no collective institutions. And I think it is right to talk about this flat world because the cars might run faster in a flat surface, but also can crash on the wall in a worst, possible scenario. So coming back to the central is that, yes, we're living in a world that is flat for some things like finance, like money, like technological transfer and so on, but it's not flat in terms of value system, in terms of migration, in terms of culture and so on. And please don't make it flat, because flat in many cases means the destruction of our environment, the elimination of indigenous people, the elimination of cultural values, the elimination of the collective existence. The world crisis today is very different from the previous crisis I have been involved as an actor. I've been a passive actor in a few more, but as an active individual in this world, I've been active in 1973 in the first oil shock, in 1979 in the second oil shock, the post-mortem, which is the debt crisis of Latin America for 5 years, the Asian crisis, and now this crisis. These are crises that I have lived, that nobody will tell me exactly what happened. I know what happened. The issue is that the first four are very different from this one. And there are 2 or 3 points of difference before we see whether this will benefit the poor or not, or whether capitalism is going to disappear. One is that this is a collective crisis. This is not an individual crisis. That is to say, we need collective instrument and collective solutions. And we are not proposing collective instruments and collective solutions. Why? Because we have not self-realized collective values like solidarity, interdependence, equity, and so on, which are fundamental in addressing a collective crisis. Secondly, we don't have the mechanism to create collective wealth and collective distribution of wealth. And third, we don't have organizations that are collective. The World Bank is not collective. Chile, the United States, Spain, China, they act on their own self-interest in that organization. They don't have a collective view, the right collective view of humanity. The IMF is not collective. The World Trade Organization, the United Nations is not collective, although it's more closer, it's closer to being collective than anyone else. The United States in the United Nations act as an independent nation, representing its own interest and its own ways of doing, and will claim and fight and negotiate. So what do we need in order to address this crisis of today is to find new collective instruments and new forms of collective interaction that will enable us to resolve this issue. The traditional instrument, more consumption, more trade, more growth, will not work. This is something that I have seen in many places of the world. Maybe we need to grow less. Maybe we don't have capacity to grow more. Secondly, in terms of poor countries and poor people, and rich countries and rich people, we cannot tell the developing world that the yardstick of their future is to become a United States. This is not possible. There are no resources. It's culturally not possible. And my friends, it's not desirable. Material transformation is only one aspect of our life, and material transformation cannot go on its own road without a spiritual transformation. So we are promoting a solution to the world crisis in a model of highly materially oriented and very little identity spiritually oriented. And this is chaotic when it comes to the collective. Amartya Sen, wrote this book on development as freedom. He didn't say development as consumption, development as technology, development as production, development as this, that, or the other. This title alone by Amartya Sen opens up a great deal of questions as to how we will come out of this crisis. And I think the poor will certainly come worse off. Finally, in relationship to whether the crisis means the end of capitalism, I think the crisis raises a big opportunity to discuss attributes of capitalism that are not working. I don't want to say we are building the coffin of capitalism, because capitalism without a surname doesn't mean much. Capitalism means capital. We need capital. The question is, what form of capital will get us where we want to go after this crisis? And I'm saying traditionally man-made capital, like physical capital, financial capital, will not do. The world will come out of this crisis expanding institutional capital, human capital, cultural capital, and spiritual capital. This is the opportunity to shift into a form of collective existence, accumulating this form of capital. Remember that poverty, one of the key elements of poverty, is an inability to accumulate capital. So we need to see what forms of capital are in the hands of the poor, so the poor can come out of poverty. And it's not money that will make the poor come out of poverty, although money help. Physical capital help, but what really will bring out is those forms of capital that are abundant for the poor, which are their value, their identity, their human horsepower, and their spirituality. That entrepreneurship is a fundamental topic in this century, but it's not a new topic. I think we go through cycles, about invention. It was not called entrepreneurship, but it was called invention. It was called science in many cases, When we talk about incubators, in the world since Atlantis and Lemuria existed, there were incubators, laboratories training people to get to know more than just what you see in front of your nose. But let's assume that this is a new topic. Why is a new topic? Entrepreneurship is a new topic because we are hungry of new solutions to the world. You know, we know how to produce. Maybe you are an entrepreneur if you find another sneaker that does it better. But there are zillions of trademarks on sneakers, and we don't need trillion and one more to resolve the running. You know, maybe those very high sophisticated runners might need this new sneaker, but the world knows how to produce sneakers. We know how to produce food. Maybe in some cases we need very sophisticated changes to do this. The world does not have a problem of production or consumption. The world has a problem of distribution, which brings the topic and debate on entrepreneurship from business entrepreneurship alone to social entrepreneurship. What is a business entrepreneur? Is that person that is fully aware of the business, of how to do finance, how to do accounting, how to do marketing, how to do strategic thinking and so on, how to make profit. A true business entrepreneur is a person who really creates, with capital C, for this business enterprise. Okay? So it creates many things, new technologies, new processes, new ways, etc., etc. But to be only a business entrepreneur is not enough, because the corporation, the company, the entity that is benefiting from business entrepreneurship is part of an environment that contains two environments. One is natural environment and the other one is human environment. So the social entrepreneur is that person who is not only aware of the business of the corporation itself, but is aware of the external impact of the business into the environment and into the human reality, the social. That's why we talk about social entrepreneurship in connection with the triple bottom line, or with social corporate responsibility and the Equator principles for banking and so on. All of these are interconnected topics, because we are saying you as an entrepreneur should not only create for the selfishness of profit, but you need to create in a way that profit making does not eliminate our environment and does not destroy social structures over the longer term. However, this is not enough. Business entrepreneurship, social entrepreneurship is not the end of the story. You cannot be a social entrepreneur if you don't have self-identity, because your self-identity is influenced and part of the human environment and the natural environment. So this is what I call the spiritual entrepreneur. The spiritual entrepreneur is a person who is not only aware of the external impact of the corporation into the outside, but is aware of him or herself. The people who are not aware of him or herself do not necessarily are aware of the external environment. For example, let's say that in my mind I am a racist, that my level of spirituality is such that I am a mind that discriminates against a race, a color, or something. Then I am coloring my relationship with the human environment and the natural environment. I will say, okay, this is not poverty, this is just problem with black people, we are just affecting a minority. But if you are really sensitive to human interdependence and you are not a racist, you are really a person of equity and standing, you will have a different perspective on how the company affects a human environment. If, as an individual, my level of awareness is very low in relation to nature, nature is inferior, non-intelligent, is to be used, I am the conqueror of nature, if that is my level of awareness, then the way I perceive the impact of my corporation on the environment will be very different from someone who is highly self-interconnected with nature and say, no, wait a minute, we cannot affect this forest, we cannot affect this river, we cannot affect this groundwater, we cannot affect this air, we cannot affect this space. That is part of a spiritual entrepreneurship. It will not come necessarily from business and from social entrepreneurship. So any university that is in the business in inverted commas, of entrepreneurship first need to create spiritual entrepreneurs. Now, I like to end by saying I don't want to separate business entrepreneurship from social entrepreneurship, from spiritual entrepreneurship. This is like three spheres that are interacting simultaneously. I have separated for purposes of presentation, but actually I am part of the environment. I am the environment. I can be the decision maker one day, but then I can be the consumer next day. I can be the producer one day. I can be the trader another day. I can be the producer one day. I can be the one receiving pollution the next day, etc., etc., etc. So the question is not to separate them, but acknowledge the existence of these three interconnecting spheres. I think we need to understand what poverty is all about. First, we have two types of poverty. One is material poverty, I don't have money. Another one is a spiritual poverty, I don't know who I am. I think we don't need to confuse this because many people who might be materially poor have a tremendous sense of self-identity. For example, Bhutan. You know, Bhutan is a poor country, but it's a country with very high level of self-identity. We have countries like Costa Rica, which are middle-income countries, you know, with very high level of self-identity. The Costa Ricans know what they want. We have rich countries like Sweden and Norway with very high levels of self-identity. So when we talk about a map between material transformation and a spiritual transformation, we are in a plane where we need to look at this in a combined way. Second, to analyze poverty, to evaluate whether we are eliminating poverty or not, we need to focus not on poverty, but on the creation of wealth, because it's the alternative forms of wealth creation that create poverty. It's the creation of wealth for a few that create poverty for a large majority. It's not like these guys are poor and somehow parachuted poor. No, they are a consequence of wealth creation. And so as much as we deal and face the issue of poverty, we need to also learn how to manage wealth. This is central to this crisis because one of the interesting issues of the world crisis of today is that this is the crisis of the rich. You know, we are talking about the crisis of banks. We're not talking about the crisis of Mrs. Gonzalez, you know, in El Salvador. Nobody cares to discuss this. The newspapers, you know, media is full of issues regarding the loss of wealth of the rich. Is not talking about the loss of wealth of the poor. So when we talk about poverty, we need also to talk about wealth creation and the rich. Now, whether the World Bank or any other bank will resolve the poverty issue or not is a big question mark. Empirically, in my personal view, we are losing the battle on poverty. Even if we comply with the Millennium Development Goals, which we are not complying with them, which is the first Millennium Development Goal, you know, and we are not very far from 2012, you know, this is not something, or 2015, is not really far. Even if we resolve and cut by half the level of people in absolute poverty, because of demographic factors, there will be another billion of people in poor areas. And now we know through this crisis that we lost 20% in the purchasing power of the poor, so the poverty line moved from $1 a day to $1.20 per day. So whether the World Bank or anyone else will be able to resolve poverty, I have doubts. But let me tell you one thing. It is essential that any program the World Bank or anyone else does has the poor first, the poor second, and the poor third. It's not something that you create to patronize the poor. Okay, I know what the poor want. Please accept this technology. No, this is not the way it's going to happen. Secondly, we cannot put as a yardstick of progress in terms of poverty alleviation the yardstick of the rich. This doesn't work. It's not possible. This is an oxymoron. Who told you the poor wants to have a Cadillac? Why do you create an economy that only functions through consumption? So now, in this crisis, we are indebting developing countries so they can increase their consumption and make the poor new consumers. So somewhere, somehow, in the end, they will have, the wealth of the rich. This is not possible. In addition, there are no resources, material resources or financial resources in the world for us to become all equal in terms of purchasing power, in terms of wealth. I give you one example. This line, this line defining the poor of 1.20 means around $1,600 per year of a family of four. In Michigan, in Ann Arbor, Michigan, for the same family of four, the minimum income of a family below which you are poor is $54,000 a year. So there is no way you can go to Africa and say, we are going to create an economic model that will make you to make $54,000 a year. Why? Why do we need to grow more? Why do we need to get the poor to the $50,000 mark? These are all fallacies of economics that we need to correct. And this crisis is proving that we have less and less an ability to resolve the problems of the poor. Another issue about World Bank and poverty is that countries are losing the sovereignty in economic policy. And as they lose sovereignty in economic policy, internal domestic policy becomes weaker and weaker, and so it's the world deciding what they have to do. For example, if you have a European central bank, naturally European banks or central banks of European countries have less power in managing monetary policy. The same thing in the United States. If the Federal Reserve, is the one commanding, it's very difficult for individual banks to control and manage monetary policy. It is happening the same thing in Africa in relation to the French franc of the past and so on. So countries are losing sovereignty through the creation of new authorities that weaken domestic authority. Two, there are many international agreements and imposed international agreements on countries that do not allow them to have sovereign social policies. And this is central for poverty alleviation. I would not like to be really the Minister of Social Work or the Minister of Labor in some developing countries, because the degree for me to maneuver my policy is almost zero. These countries are managed by ministers of finance, economy, and public works. This is what really dominates the government. So as we lose sovereignty in social policy, the war against poverty is diminishing to zero. And America, this country, is facing a very similar situation today. That it lost sovereignty because the world has no frontiers. There is no way to limit the transfer of capital and the transfer of labor, despite of the millions of dollars to have a wall in Rio Grande. It's very difficult to actually do that. And so you lose sovereignty because you make a move, and then this move not only creates incentive for local people, but creates incentive for the rest of the world. I used to say when I was at the bank that if we do not resolve the problems of Africa in Africa, Africans will be in New York City. Believe me, this is no way to stop people migrating to where it's more material wealth. So it is fundamental that the World Bank does something to dent into this, but it's not up to the World Bank, it's up to the government. It's not up to the government, it's up to their democracy, it's up to their organization. So I think this is important to take into account. Development is the process, the instruments, the actions for human transformation and self-realization. This is not esoteric. This is very fundamental to be understood. Development is not development of something. Development is development of someone. So if it is development of someone, it means that we need to know who that someone is, what is he doing here in this planet, and how can we help this someone to fulfill his or her mission in this particular planet. This is true development. The rest is gross development, is material development. Okay? So development is the collection of instruments, actions, and processes for human self-realization in whatever form or shape or activity this person is to be. Shoemaker, cook, housewife, lawyer, someone who is cleaning the streets of Chicago. It doesn't matter. The central epicenter of development is your capacity to fulfill your own mission in this planet. The rest is just going through this planet, and this is not necessarily development. Now, let me now move into the traditional way to answer this question, which is not what I believe in. First, there was a lot of attention on economic growth, that is to create a larger pie. This is capital accumulation. More physical infrastructure, more banking, more projects, more widgets, more this, more this, more this. We created an ocean of development equal to growth, expansion of the economy, that was all me, and more. And we are suffering from this fallacy because more is not better. Industrialization has created pollution. Economic development has destroyed the environment. Advancement has declined the betterment of many people. There are many small votes now that cannot take, the big wave and advance. The second part was socioeconomic development, which was not only a concern about economic growth, accumulating, having a larger pie, but was concerned about how the pie was consumed. It was something about distribution. So we spent a lot of time in the 60s and 70s and 80s, addressing the issue of distribution of wealth, distribution of product, and so on and so forth. So there was a lot of attention to equity issues. Then we said this is not enough. We not only need to focus on making the pie grow or distributing in a certain way, we need to be able to maintain a capacity for growth and for this distribution, which it came to the issue of sustainable development. It's not only about me, but it's future generation. It's not about my space by other spaces. When I say my space, I am using pesticides. It's polluting your space. That's the other space. So it was not only about me producing pears with high levels of pesticides and agrochemical, but it was about the impact on other spaces. It was not only about one type of capital accumulation, like physical and financial capital. Sustainability was about other forms of capital, in addition to these two, which are human capital, institutional capital, cultural capital, and spiritual capital, and natural capital, of course, nature. So we created this notion of sustainable development, which meant a balance among all these forms of capital. We cannot go too much to the extreme of physical capital because we destroy natural capital. We cannot conserve everything, don't move on the natural environment, because we have to grow on the physical or the human capital, and so on and so forth. This transition from growth to development, from development to sustainable development, has shown that we don't have a framework to deal with them simultaneously. They are intransitive, as they say in mathematics. If A is greater than B and B greater to C, does not necessarily mean that A is greater than C. In other words, if growth is very fast and development is also picking up, doesn't mean that it's sustainable development. It's not going to make it. Larger pie with different distribution does not ensure sustainability in the longer term. Now, what do we find today in the world? That we are focusing on growth. So we're very concerned about growth rates going down, China from 17 to 5, Europe from 3, 4, 5, 6% to 1 or minus 1, America, below 1%. We are concerned about the pie. So nobody wants to be politically incorrect to really redistribute the pie we have. So we are not addressing issues of development, really. Very little. Nobody wants to give Peter to Paul or Paul to Peter. This is something we, cannot run campaigns, against any group, There cannot be groups that are worse off because people say, wait a minute, this is not correct. So we have a gap between growth and sustainable development because development is not working. Which part of development is not working? The social part, the human part, the institutional part. So the bottom line of development is the human being. And if it is the human being, then we need to empower the human being to do something. So my sequence is growth, development, sustainable development, empower development. You know, many, many years ago, I was talking to one of my bosses, and we talk about writing a book about the next stage for the world, and we call it empower development. It was not possible, you know, to have all these norms, these rules, these markets, these organizations, this process of wealth creation with people that are disempowered. It's not possible. It's not possible to have the power only in a few hands in the corporate world or in a social class or in a caste and the rest waiting for some crumbs to come down. That's not possible. Again, this is very difficult because we are talking about material power. I need to eat, I need school, I need health services, I need water, I need housing, but also we are talking about inner power, the power of the self, your self-identity, your culture, who you are, where you are going, and whether the system helps you or breaks you back from getting where you think you need to be. This is the greatest frustration of the youth, for example, now, that they see growth and all of this debate, they see development and all this debate, you know, and so on and so forth. And in the end, they don't see the space for them to become who they want to be. So the empowerment side, on the inner side of them, is gone. There's nothing there for them. And I think that the next stage will be empower development on several dimensions. One, inner and outer. You cannot have power without having inner power, wisdom. You can have a lot of power, but with no wisdom, it doesn't work. So there is an inner and an outer dimension of power. Then you have the individual power and the collective power. You know, it's not only my power. My power needs to be inserted on everyone's power. I cannot live in a society where very few people have the power and the rest has no power. This is just a recipe for social instability and total self-destruction. People have to have power at the collective level. This is why many people are fighting the reforms of the international organizations. You know, what is the democracy at that level? This is why many governments in Latin America are moving towards socialism, because the traditional power structures are not giving them, they did not give them the opportunity to self-empower the poor. So the poor now is electing governments that are very radical, and people are very concerned, you know, because of the way they are behaving in the radical. But this populist movement in Latin America, in Argentina, in Venezuela, in Ecuador, in Bolivia, etc., they belong to the people. The people are saying, look, this is some form of participation, some form of democracy, representative democracy, which we didn't have before. And they are not thinking only material being, you know. No, they need identity. They feel identified with those governments. Just look last week, the overwhelming majority of the president of Ecuador, very young economist, I know him for many, many years since he was a student of economics. You know, this person got an overwhelming endorsement, you know. And this is not about wealth, because wealth might have gone up, you know, but not a lot. So people are looking at development with different eyes. So when Amartya Sen says development as freedom, he's hitting on a nerve, you know. Voices of the Poor, which was done by the World Bank, and they say, well, what is important for you? Empowerment, security, and opportunity. They didn't say money, money, moo. You know, and so the issue is that people are not just looking for having or doing. That's why I come back to the beginning. Development is the collection of instrument, incentives, and actions to self-realize yourself individually and collectively. The triple bottom line is to focus on three main areas. One, profit. Two, environment. And three, social. This is not new. In fact, these people are copying from a long debate we had on sustainability in the 60s and 70s, when we concluded that sustainability was environmental sustainability, economic sustainability, and you know, natural environmental sustainability. So these three forms is the same here, you know. We talk about profit, you know, social, and environment. The problem we need to ask ourselves is whether we have the self-realization of what this means. You know, it's putting the cart in front of the horse with this concept, in a sense that people say, yeah, I know what you're saying. I can identify this triple bottom line. You know, it's obvious. Alfredo, look, I know it. And if you look at the internet site of the large corporation of the world, all of them use this language. The question is why in the end the world is worse off? You know, what is happening here? Where is it that we find a breakdown in the system, and why this breakdown does not allow corporations to fulfill this triple bottom line? And I would say, number one, because the attention the market gives to the three of them is not the same. You know, the market signals are more attuned with the first bottom line than with the last two, environment and social. So the signals of the market, when I buy a computer, when I buy a banana, is more related to the gains that I make in consumption and you in production than really about environmental impact of having consumed an extra banana. The price system of the market is not embodying, is not embracing pollution abatement or environmental cost over the long run. There is no market that really embodies the long run environmental cost of consumption. So when I consume something in the supermarket, I have no clue whether consuming one extra will destroy the environment in Brazil because they cut the Amazon or the Congo basin or the Andean mountains. I have no clue. So the market as a mechanism of production and exchange, which is central to economic growth of this corporation, is not providing the signals. So the question is, who is going to provide these signals? And here is when the tension comes between Adam Smith's invisible hand, you know, if you want, and the actual system. This tension is, who is going to do this? In the beginning, in the 60s and 70s, the empresarios used to say, this is a problem for the government. You know, we are here to produce. We're going to generate employment. We will produce food and cars and canoes and blue jeans and shirts and t-shirts. The environment is the realm of the government, is the realm of the common good. I cannot do it by myself. We need to do it collectively. We have elected this collective body and so on. Now, what happened with this collective body? There is collusion between this collective body and this other body of corporations. So they're saying, don't touch the economic system. Keep it free. No regulation. So who is going to send the signal to this corporation and say, look, bananas from this place are destroying the environment, don't harvest them, you know, don't promote this technology, don't promote this organization of labor because it's creating more poverty in Indonesia and so on. Who is going to give those signals? Nothing. There is no mechanism available except international ones like ILO and many other international organizations are trying to regulate the system. But they don't have the power. In the end, the power is in the hands of corporations. So what I am proposing to the world is the creation of mechanisms at the interior of corporation that enlighten these topics through enlightening the actors within those corporations. If the actors in corporation are not enlightened, they will not see this, you know, because this pollution, this social instability, this elimination of indigenous people, this global warming, etc., 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 needs to come from an awareness of those who create strategic plans, those who create products, those who sell products, and so on and so forth. If you are in the pharmaceutical industry, for example, it is your responsibility also, not only government, to say, look, this product is not safe. I will not produce it. You know, don't hide it. Look at the debate on cigarettes. Look at the debate on generics. You know, it's a very messy thing. Look at the debate on genetically modified food. You know, what are we doing? What are we actually doing? So this triple bottom line is a beautiful way to distract the mind if you don't have a framework that is able to put this triangle itself. You can move between one and the other. You know, you can move between environment and profits. More or less, there are some relations you can manipulate through technology and so on. You can move between profit and social. You can move between social and the environment. Very difficult access here. But can you move in the 3-1 simultaneously? The only way is a sphere, which is human consciousness, that envelops this triangle and is able to move it like a pyramid in all possible directions, so you maximize the human betterment of what the corporation is all about. So I'm proposing a new theory called corporate enlightenment. You know, corporations that have body and soul and are sensitive not only to profits, which they do have, but also to human and environmental, not as a regulation thing, not as an obligatory thing, but as a fundamental way to create the spaces for it. In the future, workplaces will be places of self-realization. There are survey after survey in the last few years that are published in the internet saying that the workplace for people is more than just work, that the workplace entails more than just work. And this is very important, because if you look at what is happening in corporations, they have clubs, they have sport clubs, they have yoga classes, they have spiritual groups, they have dialogues, open dialogues, open, exchanges with the staff and management. People have realized that we are not just workers, we are not just there factors of production. So the workplace for managers, CEOs, as well as the lowest in the rank worker, is more than just work. When I worked during 45 years, my office was more than just a desk, a computer, and a chair. It was a place where my body, my soul, my mind was being transformed through my terms of reference to deliver on the job. So the cleanliness of my office, the smell of my office, who comes to my office, how do I treat my office was very important. Obviously, the whole building, the whole bank, was of fundamental importance for me. So we have groups that care about catering, what people were eating. We care about the greening of the building. We care about where the conference room were, where if we didn't have a gymnasium, whether we should have yoga teachers or not, whether we have a meditation room or not, and so on. If you go to the UN, there is a meditation room. You can go there and be in silence. Do it. So the place of work is much more than this triple bottom line. And I think that is what is missing. Is missing a framework that enables a manager to make that decision. In the end, managers need to have higher levels of consciousness to maintain high levels of coherence so they can move into this triangle in a way that they found solution. Otherwise, low level of coherence, low level of consciousness will not allow the triple bottom line to actually prosper. First, about social responsibility, I think we need to understand the two terms, social and responsibility. If we don't have a clear understanding of what means social and what is the meaning of responsibility, we will be talking here at cross purposes, like two ships passing in the middle of the night. Social, we more or less know. There is a social capital, there are human relations, there are human interactions, there are social organizations, there are incentive structures, etc., that are collective, that form the so-called social capital that we need to preserve, expand, and really mobilize. You need to mobilize people to be in development. So the social part is easy for people to understand. I think the part that is difficult to understand is the meaning of responsibility. Responsibility as regards to whom? In responsibility, the word responsibility means that you are interconnected to someone else. Otherwise, responsibility does not exist. And the question is whether corporations are sensitive to responsibility, and the question is in regard to whom and what. But this yardstick behind responsibility is central. Responsibility is not normative for the sake of normativity. It's in relation to some collective form, some collective normativity. The problem we have today is that the corporations have so much power that they live in the world of self-normativity. You know, they are self-normative. I decide when to reorganize. I decide when to hire, when to fire. I decide whether I move from Thailand to Chile, from Chile to Brazil, from Brazil to Bangkok, etc., 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 etc. We are in a world of self-normativity. Why? Because we are totally insensitive to collective existence. So the problem with social corporate responsibility is that despite of its merits, despite of the importance of saying, look, this is about someone else or something else, and this is about the collective. These two dimensions are central to all the list that is under the rubric of social corporate responsibility, on the environment, on the social, on the stability, and so on and so forth. And I would say that social corporate responsibility has not advanced a lot. I read many corporations' goals and principles. They're there. You know, everyone is using the language. But we see today in the world, you know, that nobody's doing too much. You know, the same thing with the Equatorian principle for banking. I have not yet seen, and maybe it's my ignorance, a world meeting of bankers about the banking crisis. I have not seen it. Where are they? You know, why they don't have come up with a world conference on banking? My friend, this is not a banking crisis. This is a crisis of bankers. You know, it's the mind of those in banking, not this bank building. Building is not responsible for this. It's the people in banking who need to be responsible. Where are they? A year ago, they had the highest profit margin in the history of banking. Where is the profit? Where are these profits? There was an article in Time magazine this past week saying that the bailout in America of banks is the best business that banks will ever have if they survive this period. Because they will get rid of polluted portfolios and they will sell back these portfolios to the government, in a sense, with taxpayers' money. So when we talk about, you know, social corporate responsibility, what are we talking about? When we talk about salary differences of the last 20 years, 20 times 20 years ago, 400, 600 times now between managers and workers. What is this? The bonds and all these perks that they get, you know, out of these bailouts. You know, what is this? You know, so what is social corporate responsibility? I think this is a topic where the concept has advanced faster than the self-realization, and therefore the concept has advanced faster than practice. I think I am old enough now as an economist to have a perception of cycles. And we go through the cycles all the time, you know. An economist, like the ones you mentioned, you know, they make business out of this debate, you know. Oh, I'm the macro. If I say the macro, you will say the micro, you know, and we will be there and we write a journal article and we will have this great debate, these big grants, you know, and the thing goes on. And then there will be a third guy who will come and say, you know, this is neither macro or micro. They will create terms like glocalization. You remember it was globalization, is localization, this is a game. But in substance, what Mohamed Yunus found in his dissertation was that money is equal to trust and not just money. This is the essence of Mohamed Yunus' PhD dissertation. And so he said two things. One is that in order to have high levels of efficiency in lending and recovery, you need to get 4 or 5 people akin to each other. This is the trust part. And not to have a one-to-one relationship. And the second, he found out that the expenditure patterns of men and women at the poverty level were very different, and so he tended to give more lending to women. And the success of microcredit, was basically not because money was running behind matter, but money was running behind human welfare, and he proved that he could have a microcredit system highly reliable with high levels of return to the original investment. However, these microcredit systems cannot work with macrocredit systems at the same time. You cannot have a set of incentives coming from the bottom up, microcredit, with a totally different set of incentives from the bottom down. Why? Because money is money. We don't distinguish a quarter or a dollar coming from the bottom or coming from the top. It is exactly the same. So you cannot have interest rate policies or allocative efficiency policies of macro credit that go against microcredit. For example, let's say that you corner microcredit into a small scale enterprise, and macrocredit is creating disincentive for a small is beautiful and creating incentive for industrialized large scale operations, then the system will not work because the macro will really soak the micro. Now the success in Bangladesh, which is the fundament, is not only there, but that's where it began, it was a success in a very poor society where the macro system was completely dislocated, disconnected to this part of society. The large bank was not efficient to provide a credit of $50. The size of the loan was too costly if it was too small for a large bank. So the large banks do not lend. It's like the World Bank doesn't lend for a small project because it's too costly, because the process of lending is the same no matter whether you lend $1 or $1,000. And this is where he found a niche, that actually the banking was the people. The bank was not Mohammed Yunus. The bank was the people there. So the banking was this group in Bangladesh, in Dhaka or wherever they were, that were producing rice and that wanted to buy a special machinery for rice harvesting, but it was a collective one. So he demonstrated that microcredit functioned because money is seen as a collective entity and not just a private entity. So whether it's macro or micro, it seems to me is not relevant. What is relevant is to know what is the opportunity cost of capital at the margin. And he found out that the opportunity cost of capital at the margin of very small loan was very high. That's why there was a great demand for it. But that doesn't mean that the opportunity cost of capital of large loan is not high. It could be very high too, It all depends on what the conditions are. So credit market needs to be fluid. Credit market cannot be segmented very well because money flows wherever is the highest return. So if I am in the micro business and I know that there is a loan from a bank, highly subsidized, I will not get into the Mohammed Yunus bank. I will go to the large bank and get this money as much as I can. So you cannot control money really. So I think whether it's macro or micro, to me, is not particularly relevant. It's the philosophy and the policy package behind the macro and the micro that needs to be compatible with the opportunity cost of capital at the margin for the users of those monies. Actually, a few years back, I did a huge study of saints because I wanted to know what makes them saints. What is sainthood? I was fascinated by reading hundreds and hundreds of stories about saints and why they were canonized, what they make sense. So I know the story of Saint Vincent de Paul. Saint Vincent de Paul essentially was concerned about the dispossessed, the poor, the disempowered. And he was so intense on this that his congregations were kicked out of many countries, because they were against the establishment. So if this university wants to reflect, wants to be nourished by the values embodied in the canonization of Saint Vincent de Paul, then the essence of this university is not to create material beings, but to create a spiritual being. Because to help the poor and the dispossessed, you need to self-realize poverty. You need to self-realize compassion. What is compassion? Compassion is an ability. It's not give. It's an ability to become the other without losing your own identity. I don't need to be poor to be compassionate. To be compassionate needs two things. One, this ability to become the poor without losing my identity. And secondly, which is essential in Vincentian philosophy, is to be committed to the solution of poverty. These two things need to go hand in hand. That is to say, first, you need to have the right vision of the corporate world if you are going to create MBAs. And then create the capacity to resolve the problems in the corporate world. Not only to create guys who will expand the machine of the establishment in the corporate world. The same thing with entrepreneurship, medicine, law, any of these professions you are creating here, communications, computer science, public relations, international affairs, economics, needs to be embedded in the self-realization of St. Vincent de Paul values and canonization architecture. If not, then the university is very nice, very beautiful, but doesn't get anywhere. Second, this university is a Catholic university. As a Catholic university, you need to be embedded in Christhoodness. The rest doesn't really matter for this university. If the university is going to hide Christhoodness, or doesn't have the ability to translate Christhoodness into career development, then we have a problem. What is Christhoodness? It's to be able to die for the collective so you can actually become what you came here to become. Christ came to the earth with a universal message. This was not a message for Catholics. Catholics did not exist at the time. They were calling Christians, because of Christ. The message of Buddha is universal message. It was not only for Buddhists. The message of Muhammad was for not only for Islam, was for the whole world. Whether you like it, agree or disagree, is a different issue. So the message of Christ is embedded in a universal way to conduct human life. This has to be core to Catholic teaching. And Catholics have a tremendous wealth of theology, catechesis, and practices to make a difference of an MBA in DePaul University from an MBA of Harvard, from an MBA of an Indian Institute of Management, from an MBA in the University of Peking, etc. There must be a difference. There must be an imprint of every professional this university get out, and this imprint, that we are putting on the student has to do with the self-realization of St. Vincent de Paul values into their profession. Medicine, life. Law school, justice. Economics, poverty alleviation, the other. Architects, the space, the self-realization of the collective space, not just my space, the collective space. Environmental management, equal intelligence. St. Vincent de Paul had a very clear view of the relationship between his spiritual transformation and the quality of the environment. So whenever he attended the poor, he did not give the poor second-class services. On the contrary, gave first-class services, what created a lot of problems for the people who believed that they were the only ones to receive first-class services. How come these people are being defended, protected, nurtured, dealt with their education, health, nutrition, housing, and so on? We need to have first-class education in DePaul University, but define first class as a process of self-realization of St. Vincent de Paul values and Catholic values. Otherwise, you are creating widgets, and there will be no difference between being educated in a Catholic university or being educated on any university. So it must be mandatory in this university: ethics, moral, spirituality, prayer, contemplation, etc., etc. Otherwise, this is just a university with some interesting courses that are optional, like the course in religion and economics. It should be mandatory for everyone. If you are in a Catholic university, how many people in this university study the Bible? I studied 3 years, maybe not enough. But who really in this university? This is not discriminating against those who don't believe in the Bible. That's not the issue. The issue is to create an environment for excellency in a value system that will really send people out, not in this machine, in this roller of cakes going out. No, people who really have a color, a texture, a form, a light, an energy that says, wow, I know this guy comes from St. Vincent de Paul. This is something you need to evaluate. I have not evaluated, but that to me is the advice. So when you look at the School of Entrepreneurship, these 4 elements of entrepreneurship need to be corrected. We need to add self-realization. We need to add spirituality. It's not about corporations. It's not about your success. It's not about your ability to come back and all of this is external to Vincentian philosophy.